I never expected that a storm could save me. For most of my life, storms were just another form of chaos to be managed, another variable to be accounted for in the neat, ordered ledger of my existence. I built walls, not of brick and mortar, but of routine and predictable solitude. My apartment was a testament to this philosophy. Books alphabetized, coffee mugs turned with their handles all facing east, a digital life of pixels and vectors that I could control with the precise click of a mouse. I was a graphic designer, a man who created order from the messy requests of clients, and my own life was my most meticulously curated project. Then came Julian. He was a client, which was the first and most significant wall between us. He had hired me to design a logo and branding for his bespoke carpentry business, a venture he ran from a cabin he'd built himself deep in the woods an hour outside the city. Our initial meetings were conducted over video calls, his face framed by the warm, raw wood of his workshop. He was everything my life was not. Where I was contained and quiet, he was expansive and solid. His shoulders were broad, stretching the fabric of his simple Henley shirts. His hands, which I often saw gesturing as he described the grain of a particular wood, were large and calloused, yet moved with a surprising grace. He was a creator of tangible things, of objects that smelled of sawdust and tung oil, while I dealt in the ethereal world of light and code. His voice was the first thing that truly unsettled my foundations. It was a low, calm rumble, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards of my carefully constructed world. It was a voice that could soothe a nervous animal or, apparently, a nervous graphic designer. During our calls, I would find myself leaning closer to my speakers, not because I couldn't hear him, but because I wanted to feel the texture of that sound. It was the auditory equivalent of a weighted blanket, a comforting pressure against the thin membrane of my anxiety. The barrier of him being a client was formidable enough, but it was compounded by my own assumptions. He spoke once of a woman named Sarah who had helped him pick out a stain for a bookshelf, and my mind immediately cast her in the role of wife or girlfriend, adding another lock to a door I had no intention of ever trying. He was a beautiful, rugged man who built things with his hands and lived in the woods. He was the protagonist of a story I was not a part of. He was, in the museum of my life, an exhibit to be admired from behind a velvet rope, a masterpiece of quiet masculinity that I could observe but never, ever touch. So I cataloged him, the way a naturalist might catalog a rare species, the way his brow furrowed in concentration when he reviewed my design drafts. The faint scent of cedar and something clean, like Irish spring soap, that clung to him the one time we met in person to sign the initial contract. The way he had a habit of running a hand over the back of his neck when he was thinking, revealing a sliver of sun-warmed skin above his collar. These were my private treasures, hoarded observations that fueled a quiet, hopeless yearning. My admiration was a ghost in my own apartment, a silent companion that sat with me as I worked late into the night, perfecting the curve of a letter in his logo, a logo that felt more like a love letter with each passing hour. My life was a fortress of solitude, and I had convinced myself I was the king of that quiet castle. But every time Julian's name appeared in my inbox, every time his rumbling voice came through my speakers, I felt the undeniable truth. I wasn't a king. I was a prisoner. And he, entirely by accident, was rattling the bars of my cage. I told myself it was just a professional appreciation, a respect for his craft. But in the quiet hours, when the city outside my window was a muffled hum, I knew it was something deeper, something far more dangerous to the fragile peace I had so carefully engineered. I lived in a world of blacks, whites, and grays, and Julian was a sudden, shocking intrusion of vibrant, impossible color. A color I was certain I could only ever appreciate from a safe and lonely distance. The project was nearing its end. The branding guide was complete, the website was live, and the final invoice was ready to be sent. My carefully ordered world was set to return to its previous equilibrium. The Julian-shaped disruption was almost over. And then, an email arrived that sent a tremor through my entire system. It was from him. He loved the work, he said, but he had one final, small request. He was having a sign carved with the new logo for the end of his driveway and wanted my opinion on the placement. He felt it was something that needed to be seen in person, in its intended environment. He asked if I would be willing to drive out to the cabin for a final consultation. My first instinct was to say no. It was unnecessary. A few photographs and a diagram would suffice. It was a breach of the unspoken contract I had with myself. Maintain professional distance. But the email contained a sentence that snagged on my resolve. It just doesn't feel right to finish this without the person who designed it seeing the place it was designed for, the thought of seeing his world. The physical space that had informed his entire aesthetic was a temptation I couldn't easily dismiss. It felt like being invited past the velvet rope in the museum. I checked the weather. A storm system was moving in, but the forecast predicted it would hit late in the evening. If I went in the early afternoon, I could be there and back long before the first drop of rain fell. It was a calculated risk, a minor deviation from the script of my life. I convinced myself it was a professional obligation, a final act of due diligence for a client I respected. I typed out my reply, my fingers hovering over the keys, a strange mix of terror and exhilaration buzzing just beneath my skin. Of course, I wrote. I'd be happy to. The single click of the send button felt like a gunshot in the quiet of my apartment. It was done. The walls had been breached by my own hand. The drive out was an exercise in controlled anxiety. I listened to a minimalist classical playlist, something to soothe the frantic hummingbird of my heart. The city gave way to suburbs, and then to winding country roads flanked by dense forests. The sky was a nervous, bruised gray, the clouds gathering with a quiet menace that the weather app had failed to convey. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. This was a mistake. I should have trusted my first instinct. I should have stayed within my four familiar walls, safe in my ordered world. When I finally pulled up the long gravel driveway, the cabin came into view, and for a moment, I forgot to breathe. It was beautiful, a masterwork of timber and stone that seemed to have grown organically from the forest floor. It was solid, warm, and real. It was Julian, in architectural form, and he was standing on the porch, waiting for me. He wore a faded flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up to his forearms, and his smile was a small, genuine thing that made the gray day feel a little brighter. "Leo," he said, his voice that same familiar rumble, but without the digital filter of a speaker. It felt richer, deeper. It settled in my chest. "Glad you could make it. The place is incredible," I managed, my own voice sounding thin and reedy in comparison. "Built it myself," he said with a quiet pride that was miles away from arrogance. "Come on, I'll show you where the sign's going to go." We walked to the end of the driveway, and the wind began to pick up, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. It rustled the leaves in the trees above us, a sound like a collective sigh. Julian pointed to a spot beside two large oak trees, explaining how the morning light would hit the carved wood. I tried to focus, to offer professional advice about sight lines and typography, but my awareness was fractured. A significant portion of my brain was dedicated solely to tracking his proximity, the fact that he was standing close enough that I could feel a faint warmth radiating from him, close enough that I could smell that same clean soap scent mixed with the sharper, wilder smell of the woods. As we stood there, the first drop of rain hit my cheek. It was cold and startling. Then another, and another. The sky, which had been merely threatening, seemed to split open. The drizzle became a downpour in a matter of seconds, the rain coming down in thick, gray sheets. It wasn't the gentle evening shower the forecast had promised. It was a sudden, violent deluge. "We should get inside," Julian shouted over the rising roar of the storm. He put a hand on my back to guide me, a brief, firm pressure that sent a jolt straight through my rain-soaked jacket. It was a simple, practical gesture, but it felt like a brand. We ran for the cabin, the gravel crunching under our feet as the world dissolved into a blur of water and wind. By the time we stumbled onto the porch, we were both drenched. Inside, the sound of the storm was a muffled drumming against the roof and windows. The air was warm and smelled intensely of wood smoke and coffee. Julian disappeared for a moment and returned with two thick towels. "Sorry about that," he said, handing one to me. "That came out of nowhere." He ran his towel over his dark hair, droplets of water flying from the ends. I watched, mesmerized, as a single drop traced a path from his temple down the strong line of his jaw. I tried to dry my own hair, my hands clumsy and cold. My meticulously planned afternoon, my safe in-and-out excursion, had been completely capsized. I was trapped in the woods, in a storm, with the one person who could dismantle my defenses with a single look. The orderly ledger of my life was a sodden, illegible mess. And then, as if to punctuate the utter chaos of the moment, the lights flickered once, twice, and died. We were plunged into a deep, velvety darkness, the only light a faint gray wash from the windows. The only sound was the howling of the wind, the relentless drumming of the rain, and the suddenly deafening beat of my own heart. The darkness was absolute for a moment, a thick, disorienting blanket. My breath hitched in my throat. I hated power outages. They were the ultimate loss of control, a sudden severing from the predictable, illuminated world. My carefully constructed reality had not only been breached, it had been completely blacked out. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint electronic whine of appliances on standby, all the subtle background noises of modern life were gone. The silence they left behind was vast and unnerving, filled only by the storm's fury and the sound of Julian's steady breathing somewhere nearby. "Stay put," his voice came, that low rumble somehow amplified by the dark, a point of stability in the swirling chaos of my thoughts. "I've got candles. And a fireplace." I heard the soft scuff of his boots on the wood floor, a confident, unhurried sound. He clearly knew the layout of this space by heart, could navigate it by touch and memory alone. I, on the other hand, felt like a statue, afraid to move lest I knock over something priceless in his world of tangible, beautiful things. A moment later, a match scraped against a rough surface, a sharp, hopeful sound. A tiny flame bloomed in the darkness, and in its flickering light, I saw Julian's face, his features thrown into dramatic relief. He looked like a figure from an old painting, all sharp angles and deep shadows. He lit a thick pillar candle on the mantelpiece, then another on the coffee table. The room filled with a soft, warm glow, the light dancing on the timber walls and the polished wooden floors. The effect was immediate and profound. The vast, menacing darkness receded, replaced by a small, intimate circle of light. It felt less like a house and more like a cave, a primitive shelter against the raging world outside. "Better?" he asked, his eyes finding mine in the candlelight. They seemed darker, deeper than I remembered. I could only nod, my throat too tight for words. My internal monologue was screaming. I was alone, in a cabin, in the middle of a forest, in a blackout, with Julian. The sheer improbability of the situation was staggering. It felt like a scene from a movie, a scenario my own lonely, yearning mind might have concocted in a moment of reckless fantasy. But the scent of melting wax and the damp chill of my clothes were undeniably real. He moved to the large stone fireplace, crouching down with an easy grace. I watched the play of muscles in his back and shoulders as he arranged kindling and logs. He worked with an efficient, practiced economy of motion that I found captivating. He didn't waste a single movement. It was the same quiet competence I'd seen when he talked about his craft, a deep, instinctual knowledge of how things fit together. Within minutes, he had a fire crackling to life, the flames casting a lively, orange glow that pushed the shadows back even further. "The road's going to be a wash for a while," he said, stating the obvious as he rose and dusted his hands on his jeans. "Probably a few down branches, too. You're not going anywhere tonight." There it was, the confirmation of my entrapment. My anxiety, which had been a frantic hummingbird, settled into a heavy, leaden dread in the pit of my stomach. An entire night. Here. With him. "I don't have anything," I said, the words coming out as a lame protest. "My phone's almost dead. I've got a guest room. A toothbrush you can use. As for the phone, not much good without a signal anyway," he said, his tone matter of fact, as if this were a perfectly normal occurrence. For him, maybe it was. For me, it was a cataclysm. My routines, my safe spaces, my carefully maintained distance, all gone. I was adrift. He seemed to sense my panic. His expression softened. "Hey, it's all right. It's just a storm. We've got fire, a roof, and I think there's some whiskey in the cupboard. We'll be fine." He offered me a small, reassuring smile, and it did more to calm me than any logical argument could have. He made us coffee on a small camp stove he produced from a cupboard, the process methodical and soothing. He handed me a heavy ceramic mug, and my cold fingers brushed against his as I took it. The contact was electric, a tiny spark of heat that shot up my arm. I pulled my hand back as if burned, hoping the dim light hid the flush I could feel creeping up my neck. He didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign. We sat in two worn leather armchairs near the fire, the coffee mugs warming our hands. We didn't talk much at first. The storm provided all the sound we needed. I watched the fire, the flames hypnotically licking at the logs, and I became acutely, painfully aware of him. Every small sound he made was magnified in the quiet room. The soft sigh as he leaned back in his chair. The gentle clink of his mug as he set it on the table. The almost inaudible rustle of his flannel shirt as he shifted his weight. My senses, usually dulled by the sterile environment of my apartment and office, were on high alert. The space, which had felt large and open when I first arrived, now felt intensely intimate. His scent, that mix of soap, sawdust, and now wood smoke, seemed to fill the small pocket of warm air we occupied. It was overwhelming, a fragrance I knew I would associate with this night forever. I felt like I was breathing him in. "So," he said, his voice pulling me from my sensory overload. "That logo you designed. I've had more comments on it in a week than I've had on my actual furniture in a year," he chuckled, a low, pleasant sound. "I'm glad it's working for you," I said, clinging to the familiar territory of our professional relationship. It felt like the only solid ground in the room. "It's more than that," he said, turning to look at me. The firelight caught in his eyes. "You saw something. In what I was trying to do. You understood it. The way the lines of the J look like a dovetail joint. Nobody else would have thought of that. I just looked at your work," I mumbled, feeling exposed. "It's all there. The precision, the strength, the beauty." I didn't say the last part. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady on me. It didn't feel like a client looking at a contractor. It felt like something else, something I couldn't name. It was a look of genuine curiosity, of appraisal. I felt like a page in a book he was reading with intense concentration. My walls, my carefully curated professional persona, felt thin and translucent under that gaze. "I almost didn't start the business," he said, his voice softer now, more introspective. He looked away from me and into the fire. "I was an architect. In the city. Had a good job. A partner. The whole 9 yards. This was new. A crack in the facade of the self-assured woodsman. I held my breath, not wanting to break the spell. It all fell apart," he continued, his voice a low murmur. "The job, the relationship. It was a spectacular failure, all at once. I felt like a fraud, designing these massive, impersonal buildings when I couldn't even keep my own small life together. So I ran. Came out here, bought this land with what little I had left, and started building. First the cabin, then the furniture. Working with wood. It's honest. You can't lie to it. If you make a mistake, it shows. There's no hiding." He turned back to me, and in his eyes, I saw a flicker of the vulnerability he was talking about. It was a profound glimpse past the velvet rope, a look into the heart of the exhibit. My admiration for him, which had been based on his strength and his solid presence, suddenly deepened into something far more complex. It was empathy. It was a resonance. I knew what it was like to build a structure to protect yourself after something fell apart. He had built a cabin of wood and stone. I had built one of routine and isolation. "I get that," I said, my voice barely a whisper. The need for things to be honest. A log in the fireplace shifted and collapsed, sending a shower of bright orange sparks up the chimney. Outside, a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the window panes, and a branch scraped eerily against the roof. The storm was a wild thing, a living beast, clawing at our small sanctuary of light and warmth. And inside that sanctuary, the space between us had changed. It was no longer an awkward silence. It was a shared quiet, charged with unspoken things. The professional barrier between us had been washed away by the rain, and the personal one was dissolving in the firelight. I was terrifyingly, thrillingly exposed. The hours melted away, marked only by the dwindling level of whiskey in our glasses and the logs turning to glowing embers in the hearth. The storm raged on, a constant, roaring presence that cocooned us from the rest of the world. Time lost its sharp edges, becoming a fluid, syrupy thing. We talked. Not about work, not anymore. We talked about cities we'd lived in, books we'd read, the strange and winding paths that had led us to this exact moment, in this room, by this fire. With each story he told, I saw more of the man behind the solid exterior. I learned about his quiet frustration with his father, who saw his carpentry as a step down from architecture. I learned about his secret love for old, black and white movies. He learned about my childhood in a small, suffocating town and my escape to the anonymity of the city. He listened with an unnerving stillness, his focus so complete it felt like a physical touch. He made me feel seen, truly seen, in a way that was both terrifying and addictive. Eventually, the fire burned low, and a deep, bone-weary exhaustion began to settle over me. The adrenaline of the initial crisis had faded, leaving a heavy languor in its place. I yawned, unable to stifle it, and a genuine, tired smile touched Julian's lips. "Time to get you settled," he said, his voice soft. He stood, and the movement seemed to break the spell. The reality of our situation came rushing back. The guest room, a separate space. The fragile intimacy we had built would be contained to this room, to this night. He led me down a short hallway, a candle in his hand casting our long, dancing shadows on the walls. He pushed open a door. "Here you go. The bed's made. There are extra blankets in the chest if you need them." The room was simple and clean, dominated by a large bed with a beautiful, hand-carved wooden frame. "Of course." "Thank you," I said, the words feeling utterly inadequate. "For everything." "It's nothing," he said, his eyes holding mine for a beat too long in the flickering light. "Get some sleep, Leo." He started to turn away, to leave me in this new, separate space. But then, a deafening crack of thunder shook the entire cabin. It wasn't a distant rumble. It was a violent, percussive explosion directly overhead. The floor vibrated beneath my feet. I flinched, a full body, involuntary jerk, a raw nerve exposed. He stopped. He turned back. He saw it. He saw the flash of pure, undiluted fear in my eyes before I had a chance to hide it. His expression changed, the easy hospitality replaced by something softer, something like concern. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low and gentle. I nodded, but my body betrayed me with a slight tremble. "Just startled," I lied. He didn't call me on it. He just stood there in the doorway, a solid, reassuring presence against the lingering rumble of the thunder. The silence stretched, thick with everything that had passed between us that evening. The air was charged, humming with a frequency I could feel on my skin. He looked at the bed, then back at me. A question hung unspoken in the air between us. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. My carefully constructed walls were nothing but rubble at my feet. All my rules, all my reasons for keeping a safe distance, seemed like flimsy, ridiculous things in the face of this raw, elemental night. My desire for connection, a thing I had kept locked away and starved for years, was now a ravenous ache in my chest. He took a small step back into the room. He didn't close the distance between us, but the movement was an invitation. A question. He was giving me the choice. He was letting me control the space, the moment. And in that simple act, he gave me a sense of safety I hadn't realized I was craving. I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that if I let him walk out that door, if I let him leave me alone in this room, I would regret it for the rest of my life. I would return to my quiet, ordered world, but it would feel emptier than ever before. The ghost of this night would haunt me. So I took a breath, and I took a step. I closed the distance. I stopped just in front of him, close enough to feel the warmth coming off his body, close enough to see the flicker of the candle flame reflected in his dark eyes. He didn't move. He just watched me, his expression unreadable but intense. The world narrowed to this small space, to the scent of him, to the sound of our breathing mingling in the quiet air. My gaze dropped to his lips, and then, slowly, I lifted it back to his eyes. It was the only way I could ask. He must have seen the answer he was looking for. He raised his hand, slowly, deliberately, and cupped my jaw. His thumb brushed against my cheek, the calloused skin a rough, grounding anchor in the storm inside me. His touch was hesitant at first, questioning, and then it became firm, sure. He leaned in, and the world tilted on its axis. His lips were softer than I could have ever imagined. The first kiss was not a collision of passion, but a quiet, tentative exploration. It was a question and a confession and an apology all at once. It tasted of whiskey and wood smoke and the faint, clean scent of rain. I felt a lifetime of loneliness, of self-imposed exile, begin to dissolve in that single, gentle touch. My own hands, which had been frozen at my sides, came up to rest on his chest. I could feel the steady, solid beat of his heart beneath my palm, a rhythm that was so much calmer than my own. He pulled back slightly, just enough to look at me, his forehead resting against mine. His eyes searched my face in the dim light, as if looking for confirmation, for a sign that this was real. "Leo," he whispered, my name a prayer on his lips. And then he kissed me again. This time, there was no hesitation. It was a kiss of profound, soul-deep recognition. It was coming home to a place I had never known existed. The storm outside could have torn the world apart for all I cared. The only thing that mattered was the solid, warm reality of him, here, with me, in the heart of the woods, in the soft, flickering candlelight. My ordered life was over, and I had never felt so gloriously, terrifyingly free. The morning came with a quiet, apologetic light. The storm had broken, leaving a world washed clean and glistening. Sunlight streamed through the guest room window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The silence was absolute. The roaring wind and drumming rain had been replaced by a profound, unnerving stillness. I was alone in the bed. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the warm, hazy memory of the night before. I sat up, the rough blanket pooling around my waist. The other side of the bed was cold. He was gone. My mind, a traitorous and well-practiced engine of self-sabotage, immediately began to spin. It had been a mistake, a fluke, a strange, desperate act brought on by the storm and the whiskey. He regretted it. Of course, he regretted it. I dressed quickly, my movements stiff and awkward. The clothes I'd worn yesterday were still damp and smelled of rain and wood smoke. They felt like a costume from another life. Every nerve in my body was on high alert, bracing for the inevitable awkwardness, the polite but firm rejection that was sure to come. The intimate, candlelit world of last night had vanished with the dawn, and now we were just two men in the harsh, unforgiving light of day, a client and his contractor. I walked out into the main room, my heart hammering against my ribs. Julian was there, his back to me, standing by the large window that looked out over the woods. He was dressed in fresh clothes, a mug of coffee in his hand. He didn't turn around. The silence in the room was a physical weight, thick and suffocating. It was 1,000 times worse than the noise of the storm. "Morning," he said, his voice quiet, directed at the window pane. It was a different voice from the night before. It was flat, stripped of the warmth and intimacy I now craved like a drug. "Morning," I echoed, my own voice a croak. He finally turned, but he didn't quite meet my eyes. His gaze flickered to a spot somewhere over my shoulder. "Coffee's on the stove," he said, gesturing with his mug. I already cleared the big branch that fell across the driveway. The road should be passable. Every word was a small, sharp blow. He was all business, all practicalities. He was clearing the path for my departure. He was erasing the night, sweeping it away with the morning debris. The anxiety in my chest tightened into a knot of pure dread. I had been right. It was a mistake. I had misread everything. I had taken his kindness, his moment of vulnerability, and I had twisted it into something he never intended. I had ruined the one professional relationship that had ever managed to touch my solitary life. The shame was a hot, bitter taste in my mouth. I poured myself a coffee, my hands shaking so badly I almost spilled it. I didn't want coffee. I wanted to rewind time. I wanted to go back to the moment before the thunderclap, the moment before I stepped forward and shattered the fragile peace between us. I wanted to be back behind my velvet rope, admiring him from a safe distance, where the yearning was a dull, manageable ache instead of this sharp, gaping wound. We drank our coffee in that terrible, crushing silence. I stared into my mug, watching the steam rise, unable to look at him. I cataloged my escape route. I would finish my coffee, thank him politely for his hospitality, get in my car, and drive away. I would send him the final invoice via email. We would never have to speak again. The thought was both a relief and a devastation. My anxiety spiral was in full flight now. He probably thought I was pathetic, taking advantage of the situation. He was probably just being a good host, offering comfort during a storm, and I had turned it into this unbearable morning after tension. He was likely straight. He'd mentioned a partner, a woman. My mind conveniently erased the fact that he'd said it was in the past. It latched onto any piece of evidence that supported my burgeoning theory of self-loathing. I was a fool. Well, I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room as I placed my empty mug on the counter. I should get going. Thanks again for everything. The word everything was a landmine. It could mean the shelter, the coffee, or it could mean the kiss, the feel of his heart beating against my hand. I hoped he would assume the former. He just nodded, his expression still closed off, unreadable. He walked me to the door, the distance between us a yawning chasm. This was it. The end. He would open the door, I would walk out, and the brief, beautiful, terrifying intersection of our lives would be over. I reached for the doorknob, my entire being screaming in protest. Just look at me, I wanted to shout. Say something. Say anything other than this polite, dismissive goodbye. As my fingers brushed the cold metal, his voice stopped me. Leo, wait. I froze, my hand hovering over the knob. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I braced myself for the words I was sure were coming. Last night was a mistake. I'm not. Let's just forget this happened. We need to talk, he said. The four most dreaded words in the English language. They were the preamble to every firing, every breakup, every gentle letdown. This was the final, formal nail in the coffin of my foolish hope. I turned around slowly, schooling my face into a mask of neutral composure. I would take this with dignity. I would not let him see how much it hurt. I met his eyes, and for the first time that morning, he met mine. The distance, the coolness, was gone. In its place was an expression of profound, heart-wrenching uncertainty. He looked just as terrified as I felt. I've been an idiot all morning, he said, his voice low and strained. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I now recognized as a sign of his own anxiety. I woke up and I panicked. I didn't know what to say. I thought maybe you regretted it. The air left my lungs in a rush. Of all the scenarios my overactive brain had constructed, this was not one of them. You thought I regretted it? I asked, the words a squeak of disbelief. Look at me, Leo, he said, a wry, self-deprecating smile touching his lips. I'm a carpenter who lives alone in the middle of nowhere. You're put together, you're brilliant, you live in this clean, ordered world. I thought maybe the storm, the whiskey. I thought I dragged you into my mess. It was so absurd, so completely inverse to my own narrative of inadequacy, that I almost laughed. Julian, I said, my voice shaking slightly. My world isn't ordered. It's empty. It's a fortress I built because I was scared. Last night wasn't a mess. It was the first real thing that's happened to me in a very, very long time. A wave of relief washed over his face, so palpable it was like watching the sun break through the clouds. The tension in his shoulders seemed to melt away. He took a step closer, closing half the distance between us. I haven't been honest with you, he said, his gaze intense, unwavering. About a lot of things. Okay, I whispered, my heart starting a new, frantic rhythm, not of fear, but of hope. That storm, he began, then hesitated, taking a deep breath. I knew it was going to be bad. The forecast I saw was for a major system. I let you believe it was just a shower because I wanted you to come out here. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the confession. You planned this. Not the blackout, he admitted with a small, guilty grimace. But I hoped you'd get stuck here. It was a stupid, selfish gamble. For months, during our calls, I felt this connection. I wanted to see if it was real, away from the emails and the screens. I wanted an excuse to get you here, to talk to you. I was too much of a coward to just ask you out for a drink like a normal person. He looked down at his hands. And Sarah? She's my sister. She has terrible taste and would stain. The revelation settled over me, a slow, dawning wave of understanding. The chaos of the night hadn't been an accident. It had been an act of desperation, an act of hope. He hadn't been confident and self-assured. He'd been just as uncertain as I was. He had built a situation to break down the walls because he didn't know how to ask permission to knock. I've been admiring you from afar for months, I confessed, the words tumbling out now that the dam had broken. I thought you were this unattainable, perfect thing. I put you on a pedestal. I was terrified of you. A soft, genuine laugh escaped him. Terrified of me, he asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Leo, I spent 3 days trying to work up the nerve to write that email asking you to come out here. All the misunderstandings, all the false narratives and self-imposed barriers evaporated in that moment of shared, vulnerable truth. All that was left was us, two men who had been circling each other for months, each trapped in his own fortress of solitude, each convinced the other was on the far side of an impassable moat. He took the final step, closing the remaining space between us. He didn't touch me, not yet. He just looked at me, his eyes full of a relief and a tenderness that mirrored my own. So he said softly, "You don't regret it?" "No," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I don't regret it." "Good," he breathed, "because I've been wanting to do this since the first time I heard your voice." And he leaned in and kissed me again. It was nothing like the tentative exploration of the night before. This was a kiss of certainty, of relief. It was deep and sure, a confirmation of everything we had just confessed. It was the feeling of a door swinging open after a lifetime of believing it was locked. It felt like coming home. The drive back to the city was a world away from the anxious journey out. We took his truck, the decision made with a simple, unspoken understanding that we weren't ready to be separated yet. The silence between us was no longer a weight. It was a comfortable, shared space. The world outside the windows was bright and clean, the air crisp with the aftermath of the storm. Everything looked new. Halfway back, as we were stopped at a traffic light, Julian reached over and took my hand. He didn't say anything. He just laced his large, warm fingers through mine, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. The simple, solid pressure of his touch was an anchor. It was a promise. I looked at our joined hands resting on the center console, his calloused and strong, mine pale and slender. They looked like they belonged together. They looked right. We started to build a new routine, one that wasn't about isolation but about connection. It began with small things. Weekday dinners where he would drive into the city, filling my quiet, minimalist apartment with his expansive presence and the scent of sawdust that seemed to cling to him faintly, a scent I now associated with safety. He looked so out of place among my gray and white furniture, a vibrant splash of color in my monochrome world. But he also looked like the one piece that had always been missing. We spent weekends at the cabin. I learned the names of the trees, the sound of the creek that ran behind his property, the particular warmth of the morning sun as it hit the porch. He taught me how to identify different types of wood by their grain and smell. I showed him the intricacies of the design software I used, the quiet, meticulous magic of creating something from nothing but pixels and light. Our two worlds, one tangible and one digital, began to overlap and merge. One Saturday afternoon, we were sitting on his porch, drinking coffee. He was sketching in a notebook, a design for a new chair, and I was reading. It was a comfortable, domestic quiet. The kind of quiet I had always thought I wanted in my solitude, but which I now realized was infinitely better when shared. "You know," I said, looking up from my book, "if you hadn't engineered that storm, I don't think I ever would have had the courage to bridge that gap." He stopped sketching and looked at me, a soft, conspiratorial grin on his face. "Are you sure about that? I saw the way you looked at the dovetail joint on that bookshelf I made." I felt a flush creep up my neck. I was appreciating the craftsmanship. "Right?" he said, his grin widening. The craftsmanship. He put his notebook aside and leaned over, pressing a gentle kiss to my temple. "For someone who deals in clean lines and order, you were very easy to read." That was the beautiful, terrifying truth of it. All my walls, all my carefully constructed defenses, had been glass. He had seen through them from the very beginning. He had seen the lonely man hiding in the fortress, and instead of being put off by the walls, he had simply found a way to make it rain, knowing that even the strongest fortress can't keep out a storm. He hadn't broken my walls down with force. He had waited for the chaos of nature to do it for him, creating a space where we could meet in the vulnerable, honest aftermath. My life was no longer a museum where I admired things from a distance. It was a workshop, a place of creation. It was messy sometimes and unpredictable, and it smelled wonderfully of sawdust and coffee. The rigid order I had clung to for so long had been replaced by a new, more resilient kind of structure, the kind built by two people, with honest materials and a shared understanding. The storm had passed, but it had changed the landscape of my life forever. It had washed away the fear, cleared away the solitude, and in its place, something beautiful had begun to grow.